In this video, we're going to take some time to examine what a JSP is. So this is an overview to the JSP object. And then we're going to examine some of the major tools that we have at our disposal that we can use interacting with our JSP to actually make our views better and more powerful. What is a JSP? Well, JSP is a Java server page, and it's essentially a web page. So it will be replacing the HTML pages that we've seen before. The nice thing about the JSP is it gets translated behind the scenes and acts exactly like a servlet. So what that means is that all the tools and the utilities that are available to us through the servlet will also be available to us through the JSP page. So now our view will become much more powerful. So it is a view that we'll be able to use to render our data to the user and interact with the user. And it does, again, allow for just more than plain old HTML. So one of the first things that we're going to take a look at are directives. So what's a directive? Well, a directive is going to be a statement at the top of the page that allows us to do certain things before we even get started with our actual page rendering and programming. There are three types of directives that we care about, including the include directive, which just allows us to include other pages, which will be very nice for templating. We have a page directive, which will give us the ability to control things on the page, such as importing specific Java libraries for code. Is the page an error handling page? Do we allow sessions on this page? And things like ignoring expression language and scriptlets, which we'll see in a moment. And then the final directive is the tag library directive, which allows us to bring in tags that are going to essentially give us control of libraries of code. And so we'll see those as we grow as well. So the first thing we're going to take a look at then is going to be scripts, or what are more commonly called scriptlets. So scriptlets are just code in the JSP. And when we want to execute plain old Java code, we can simply wrap that code with a less than % on the start of the code block and a % greater than at the end of the code block. And that again allows us to just execute any Java code we want right in the JSP. In order to do that, of course, if we have things that are in like the Java util class, we may need to do an import. So we'll use the page directive to do that. And it may require the use of declarations, which are going to be actually creating variables. And we'll see that in just a moment. So declarations are going to be very similar to our scriptlets, but the difference is going to be if we're declaring a variable or a method or instantiating some object for use, what we're going to do is just wrap that with less than % and then the bang operator or the exclamation point. So that will start a declaration. So in that code block there, you might see int I equals 0, or you might see my person equals new person, or something like that. So then we'll move on to expressions. Now expressions and expression languages are going to be a little bit different. The expression itself is going to be the rendering of some expressions. And so what we do to get these out to the page is less than % equals, and then the expression, and then %, and then greater than to wrap that up. This will be great for filling in forms or rendering dynamic content on the page, as we need to display data from the database or some user input from a cookie that we have, for example, the user login. We could then use an expression to just output that value without having to do anything else. And then there is the expression language. Now the expression language is going to be much more powerful than just a regular old expressions that we'll be seeing right away. And so we're actually going to have a whole section later that will examine some expression language information and how we can use that. So when we get there, we'll find out that allows us to get the managed information very easily. It does communicate well with our objects and lines up very well with objects, because what we can do is start using chaining. So if you've never seen chaining, it's just dot syntax where you essentially can just drill in from your variable to its method to its property. And expression language is really well formed and allows us to do that. And we'll see that again when we get to that section. When we actually want to use an expression language statement, we'll use the $sign and brackets to wrap that expression language statement. And we'll have some implicit objects that we're going to rely on right away in the JSP because it's a servlet. But when we get to the expression language, they'll be named just a little bit differently. So instead of being just page, we'll see page scope. And instead of being just request, we'll see request scope. And again, we'll cover all that in more detail when we get there. Tag libraries are also very important. And of course, they're so important, we're going to spend another section on tag libraries later. But when we get there, what we'll find is that libraries are pre-written code. And they're really well formed, and they allow us to import the entire tag library. And what we do is use the syntax where we have the tag library directive, where we have the less than % symbol, the name of the tag library with a prefix that we assign. So this variable can be anything. We might see the letter C for the core library, for example. And then what we would have down here, we would have C : whatever the method is to run that code, and then we might have something in between the tag if we need it. The URI is going to be a defined location for our actual tag library. And we'll actually be able to do custom tag libraries as well. So JSP actions are going to be coming into play once we get especially into the core library. We'll see the standard JSP actions, including forwarding to pages, using beans, getting and setting properties, etc., and so on. So there are plenty of standard operations that we can do right out of the core library. And then there's also some other ones that aren't necessarily listed as standard, but are still in the core library, such as the out or the print writer action, where we can use a tag to just write out to the screen. And again, we'll see those once we start working more in detail with the actual tag libraries. So now that we're back on JSP, we're going to look at the implicit objects. And again, these are going to be the things that we really rely on when we're working with our code right there in the JSP, and we need to do things just like we would in the servlet. So in the servlet, we saw that we have HTTP servlet requests, and they're named requests. Well, we're going to have the same request variable here, just like we had in our doGet and our doPost. Same thing with response. Session will be easily accessible through the session variable. The servlet context itself will be actually available through a keyword application, which is more aptly named in this case. The servlet config will come through config. When we want to print out, we can just use the out variable. The exceptions that we might encounter, we could reference through exception. If we want the entire page context, which we can set now a new attribute type called page context attributes, we'll be able to do that through the page context. And if we need to reference the page itself, we would just reference the page directly. So in conclusion, what we've seen is that the JSP or Java Server pages allow us to give the view much more power. It's not just rendering things that we're spitting at it. It actually has the ability to use the variables we've set up, interact with sessions, do some more important things like actually run some code to render information through expressions or just through the out print writer. It gives us interaction with the controller, so the controller can then set up all these variables and we can use them. We can actually forward back to other controllers if we need to. Through JSP, we'll find a few new ways to navigate through pages. Definitely, we now have a lot more power to render up dynamic content. And the coolest thing and the best thing is that with JSP, there are a lot of tools that have already been programmed for us in place, as well as the things we've already learned by working with the servlets, that now we're ready to go and we can actually start building some really powerful JSP pages.